And welcome to this edition of Hidden History Stories from the Secret City. I'm Keith McDaniel, along with my co host, Ray Smith. Good morning, Ray.
Hello, Keith. How are you today?
I'm good. I'm good. We've got a special guest with us today, so why don't you introduce him, Ray?
I'm glad to have Nick Lewis with us. Nick is from the Los Alamos National Laboratory. He's a historian there, working alongside our good friend Alan Carr. And he has a presentation for us today that looks at the introduction of computing and I will lead us up to the first atomic test in the Trinity site in New Mexico. So, Nick, go ahead and share your screen and let us have that presentation, please.
All right. Well, thank you both very much for letting me join you today. This is always a very fun talk to give. It's such an important piece of not just Los Alamos history, but world history. And I enjoy being able to make it clear just how important computing, a kind of an unsung contribution, was to the success of the Trinity test, particularly because, as we'll go into, when we talk about computing, we're not just talking about machines. We're talking about people who were called computers longer than machines have been called computers. And I really enjoy being able to open people's eyes to how important these people who were at Los Alamos, mostly women, were to making this world-changing development. All right, so I'll just leap into it, and if you guys have any questions afterwards, just please go ahead and I'll do my best to come up with something good, whatever that might be. All right, so like I talked about, this is going to be kind of an overview of how computing contributed to Los Alamos during World War II, and focusing specifically on the challenges of developing the Trinity device and the success of that test, and what would become the Fat Man style weapon. It's going to focus a lot on the human and the technical networks that had to come together at Los Alamos to overcome these challenges, because they were monumental and many of them were unexpected. And that work that happened during the war was instrumental for the development of electronic computing at the lab and in the world after the war as well. And all right. Well, the first organized computing work that happened for what became the Manhattan Project actually started at Berkeley during the war, before Los Alamos existed. And that was when the Office of Scientific Research and Development, the OSRD, was running the US atomic bomb program. And Arthur Compton, who was in charge of the Chicago Met Lab, enlisted the help of theoretical physicist at Berkeley, J. Robert Oppenheimer, to work on fast neutron calculations. Those were needed to figure out how do you make a bomb work. They were working on slow neutrons, as in a reactor. They, at MATLAB, didn't really work on fast neutrons, so they asked for Oppenheimer's help. So Oppenheimer had previously assigned some of his more advanced graduate and postdocs to work on calculations for Lorenz's electromagnetic separator, because that was going to be one of the methods explored for enriching uranium. And two of his more advanced postdocs, Stanley Frankel and Eldred Nelson, he enlisted their help to work with Robert Serber. He'd asked to come back to Berkeley to work on calculations to prepare for a conference of luminaries in theoretical physics that Oppenheimer would be hosting at Berkeley in the summer of 1942. Serber was going to need a lot of computational help because he was tasked with working on neutron diffusion theory, which not much work had been done on that in the US. Most of the work that was known had come from the British. And in order to work on problems like how much nuclear material you're going to need for a weapon and the efficiency of the reaction in that weapon. You really had to know that going in, but that was impossible to know empirically. You had to do some calculations up front. And that's where Franklin Nelson, working with Serber, came in, building a hand computing group at Berkeley using desktop calculators to try to refine this neutron diffusion theory so that they could inform this conference in 1942 of how likely they thought an atomic bomb was to work, and should the government really invest in a full-scale atomic bomb program. And that's where computing first came involved with the Manhattan Project. Well, Franklin Nelson massively improved on the kind of rudimentary theory of diffusion that the British had shared. And by the time of the Berkeley conference, they were reasonably confident that an atomic bomb was feasible. This was a gun type device they were thinking about. Very simple engineering principle, but they believed it would work, but it was going to need possibly a lot more nuclear material than other estimates had predicted. So it was good news and some an important realization that a lot more work was going to be needed, both in production methods for nuclear material and for figuring out exactly how to make one of these devices work. It's funny that Franklin Nelson and Serber gave their presentation the first day of this conference, and because they were so well prepared, a lot of the physicists there thought, well, the A-bomb's a pretty settled issue. We know how to handle that. Let's pay more attention to this really interesting idea called the H-bomb that was fascinating Edward Teller. And they spent most of the conference actually talking about that and not the A-bomb. But they actually put together a report that they sent to the government, to the OSRD, passed that on to Roosevelt and the rest of the country's leadership, and said, we do believe a full-scale atomic bomb program will be fruitful, and they recommended to go ahead with it. And the government did, forming the Manhattan Project, which the Army Corps of Engineers, led by Major General Leslie Groves, took over to begin the ordnance work. So how do you actually make this device rather than just a concept? How do you make it a reality? Well, Groves, following Arthur Compton's suggestion, enlisted the help of Oppenheimer to be the lead of Project Y. So that was the as yet unbuilt lab that would actually do the ordnance work, design and construct the atomic weapons. Actually, there was an idea for an implosion device floated at this Berkeley conference, the first mentions of that, but it was kind of put to the side because it was considered a lot more complicated from an engineering standpoint. So the idea was to pursue two gun-type weapons instead, one using enriched uranium and the other using plutonium as fuel. So the lab at Los Alamos was founded partly because of Oppenheimer's recommendation. He knew the area, and he thought it'd be a secure and also beautiful place for scientists to work. And he enlisted the help of Franklin Nelson again to come to Los Alamos and replicate their neutron diffusion calculation work that they'd been doing at Berkeley. And they were among the first to arrive in early '43, and they ordered a bunch of high-speed Marchant, Frieden, and Monroe desktop calculators to support the lab's theoretical work. And a lot of these devices went off to scientists in T division. The theoretical division was going to need the most computational support because they were in charge of producing estimates of critical mass and efficiency for the physical bomb design. They'd help to guide that and to help guide production of the enriched uranium and plutonium. Later on, they would be in charge of doing simulations, mathematical models of the proposed weapons to make sure that the lab didn't follow a technical dead end, which would be disastrous. So that's why T Division had the greatest need for computing resources during the war, and that would remain true even after the war. Well, most of the other calculators that Franklin Nelson ordered went into the T5 computations group. And this was continuing the work from Berkeley, and it would be the lab's first organized computing group, and it would provide a central pool of computing resources. And part of the major function of this computing group was the fact that T Division had to know how neutrons were going to diffuse during the assembly of the gun-type weapons. So when they were being detonated, what would happen to that material? So they were initially very interested in the possibility of the chain reaction starting prematurely. So what would happen if these oddly shaped bodies came together under explosive forces, and would they go off as intended, or would it just be kind of a dud? And that couldn't be solved analytically. That had to be worked on numerically. So T Division would also draw on insights from experimentalists who would find experimental data to help inform theory, so they'd make the best theoretical estimates possible. And this meant that a lot was riding on T Division and its ability to set up and perform these reasonably accurate computations very quickly. And they initially had to rely on computing methods and technologies that hadn't changed much in centuries, and we're going to see how that was the case. Well, a few computers, and I'll define that in just a second, were distributed throughout other parts of the lab, but T5 was the first and the largest organized computing group at Los Alamos. And like we talked about before, most of the computers in T5 were women, and they were initially drawn from volunteers from the town site. Groves kind of objected to supporting civilians on the Hill if they weren't also doing some kind of work for the war effort. So he encouraged all adults on the Hill to at least work part-time on the war project, even if they didn't know what the project was specifically. Later, there would be recruits coming from the local area, like the towns of Espanola and Santa Fe. So the term computer actually goes back to the 17th century, pretty far, and it originally just referred to someone who did calculations by hand. By the 20th century, the fields of astronomy and meteorology were the largest users of organized computing groups. And at that point, the demographics of computing were starting to change, from being mostly men in the 19th century to being mostly women in the 20th, as women were starting to enter the workforce in larger numbers. And it was women who were working as computers in the mid-20th century who started transitioning into programming electronic computers, as those were introduced in the 40s and 50s, because they had the needed skill sets. Well, the first computers in T5 were mostly related to the lab scientific staff, and some of these names will be familiar. They included people like Josephine Elliott, Mitzi Teller, yes, that Teller, Kay Manley, Jean Bacher, Bernice Brode, and quite a few others. And being a computer working at the lab required some mathematical knowledge, and many of the early volunteers had degrees in math and science, and so that let them start working on the project very quickly, which was a major advantage to the lab. The chemistry and ballistics expert Joe Hirschfelder, we'll talk about more in a minute, he did a computer training course. So incoming recruits who didn't have as much mathematical knowledge, he would help them get up to speed. Well, the first leader of the hand computing group was Mary Frankel. She was married to Stanley Frankel, and she had degrees in psychology and mathematics. And she joined up with the Manhattan Project in '43 as a junior scientist. That was her title. And she was an expert in the use of numerical methods to solve physical equations. And she was the one who had set up the problems that the computers would run on their desktop calculators. So she would break down smaller problems, or break down large problems into smaller components that could be processed more easily by individuals, and then the results would be combined later. And it was a kind of early parallel processing. And she had a good sense of humor. So she would write out the problems in her office, and then she would jokingly place them in a basket out front that said, "Free, please take one." And that's how you'd get your job for the day. You'd go out and take this slip of paper from the basket in front of her office. Well, Mary Frankel really expected excellence from her staff. She had little patience for people who didn't do their jobs well. And she didn't have patience for people who didn't treat her with respect. And that was despite her being up to 20 years younger than some of the people she was leading. And she actually told Bernice Brode, who was 20 years older than her, that, you might have a future in computing if you could just learn decimals. And Bernice said, "Mary, I'm 20 years older than you. This is my future." And that was the kind of relationship they had. So about 5 or 6 computers would sit at tables with their desktop calculators and work over about a 4-hour shift using the problems laid out by Mary Frankel. And the calculators in this kind of wooden shanty building produced a lot of noise, and it could make it difficult to concentrate in there. And the machines also malfunctioned a lot because the human computing group was on the 2nd floor of this E building, and they were next to what was then an unpaved road. Now it's called Trinity Drive. And during the summer months, they had no air conditioning. The windows had to be open, and that let a lot of dust come in from the truck traffic going by for the project. And well, that could cause a lot of problems with the machines. It would cause wear and tear, and it would cause entry errors. Well, to try to protect against entry errors and just malfunctioning equipment, the group ran every calculation twice, and there would be intermediate checkpoints. Mary Frankel or another supervisor would look at the calculations at various points along the way. And broken machines, sometimes you could take a calculator with a stuck key and you could do what the military called a drop test. And that's exactly what it sounds like. You just drop the thing on the table, and sometimes it would work. If it didn't, they would send off the calculator to Santa Fe or Albuquerque to be fixed, but that caused a lot of delays. So Richard Feynman, Nicholas Metropolis, who were physicists, T-Division, they needed these calculations to be done, and they took it on themselves to set up a repair service in their office, and they even put a business sign over the door, calculators repaired here. And Hans Bethe, who's the leader of T-Division, didn't like that. He had them take the sign down and stop this frivolous waste of their time until they had a massive backlog of broken machines, and suddenly they were allowed to open up their little business again. Well, every computer's experience at the lab was a little different, but those of Kathleen Manley, better known as Kay, they were fairly typical of what it was like for a computer to work at Los Alamos. Kay was originally from Canada, and she had degrees in English and mathematics, and she was working on a teaching certificate at, or actually she was working on a master's in education at Columbia, where she met John Manley, who became Oppenheimer's principal aide during the war. And that's when they were married. And Manley was one of the luminaries at the Berkeley conference in '42. And he came to Los Alamos on Leo Szilard's invitation, and Kay followed just right after in April of '43. She brought with her their toddler and their 8-week-old baby. And when they arrived, they discovered they were in the Sun apartments, which were pretty terrible, but they were actually the best housing on the plateau, except for bathtub row. They still had exposed pipes in the ceiling, and they discovered that all their furniture had been delivered in this gigantic pile in the middle of the floor. So they spent a few days digging out, but there were some advantages. For families with two parents who worked on the project, the lab actually provided childcare personnel. They would bus up onto the hill every day, and there were also some cleaning services that were allowed for people who were both working on the project. Volunteers from the computing group were also able to schedule around childcare needs. So this made it possible for Kay, she said, to start working on the project as a computer almost immediately when she arrived on the Hill. And she said that these services were what really made that possible. She had to kind of get up to speed on working with groups. She'd not done that before, and to work with the complicated Marchant calculators. But with her degree in mathematics, she got up to speed on the project very quickly. And she worked in the lab's computing pool in T5. And scientists would usually bring their problems, like numerical integrations, that the group would work on for calculation, taking between a day and 3 days on average. And Kay remembered specifically working on a lot of hydrodynamics calculations for Robert Serber in particular. So she worked as a computer in T5 for about 6 months before she left to work to raise her children full time. So another computer, Margaret Johnson, just as an example of how people came to the lab to work as a computer. She joined T5 a bit later in the war. She was a civilian from the Espanola area. She had a bachelor's in mathematics and was starting to work on a graduate degree, but decided to go work on the war effort. Well, she came by the Manhattan Project's office in Santa Fe. This is a top secret project. And she said, "Hey, I hear you've got a top secret project going on. Do you need a computer? I'm a mathematician." And she said that, well, it was secret, but everyone knew about it. We just didn't know exactly what they were working on. Well, she was hired 3 weeks later into T Division, and she spent the rest of the war working on differential equations. And that's kind of typical of how some of these people heard about and arrived at the project. Something going on up the hill, do you need my help? So the computing group was initially pretty small, starting the spring of 43, but it grew to about 20 by the end of the summer. And that was because members of the Women's Army Corps arrived on the Hill. The WAC had been activated in July of 43, and human computers from the WAC worked alongside their civilian counterparts, even though they were paid quite a bit less. And they ultimately made up about half the computing operation on the Hill, so a major contribution. One reason why we'll see that even this growing computing effort wasn't quite enough is because Oppenheimer and the other lab planners thought that the project would need maybe 300 people on the Hill total to develop these weapons. But by middle of 1945, the lab and the town site had grown to about 8,000 people who were living and working on the Hill. And as the operation ballooned, the computing group also grew and grew to about 25 computers eventually, even though, like I said, we'll see why this wasn't enough. Well, also at the end of the first summer, Don Flanders, who's a mathematician, came to Los Alamos as the first T5 group leader. And he was the one who standardized the group's operations around just their Marchant model calculators, try to keep things a little easier to maintain. He also came up with special forms that were meant to speed up the setup and the execution of problems. And the computing work was very tedious, but Flanders had some amazing song and dance talents, and he actually wrote a comedy ballet, and it made fun of just how strange life was in Los Alamos. And he played the part of a singing and dancing General Groves, and used that to keep up morale of his group and the rest of the lab. And Bernice Brode actually remembered that they built a prop for the ballet, which was a mechanical calculator, and made a bunch of noise. It had these flashing lights, and it would churn out inaccurate calculations. 2 + 2 = 5, and that was hilarious because that's sometimes what it was like to work with these marchands. In October of 43, Franklin Nelson told Hans Bethe that even though the hand computing group was growing, the calculations for the gun type weapon were just too much. They were straining the human computers and their calculators, which need a lot more repair, on and on and on. So Bethe talked to Dana Mitchell, who was the lab's procurement officer, and Mitchell had a possible solution. Well, the year before he came to Los Alamos, Mitchell had worked at the Columbia Physics Department, being their main procurement officer. And he had seen in action Wallace J. Eckert's Astronomical Computing Bureau. And Eckert was probably the most famous numerical astronomer of his time. And he needed a lot of computational power, at first as people, to work on his theory of the motions of the moon. And that required a lot of differential equations that were really tedious. Well, he came across some IBM punch card machines at Columbia's Statistical Bureau that IBM had donated in the 1920s. And he realized that these machines might have some value to his applications. And this wasn't out of the blue. Punch card machinery, the technology, had been around since the 19th century and was first used for tabulating purposes, the 1890 US Census. But the technology goes back even further than that, with French weaving machines that would use wooden cards that would effectively program how to weave a tapestry almost automatically. So the technology was maturing quite a bit by the 1920s and 30s. So by the 20s, companies like IBM, Remington Rand produced quite a variety of machines, mostly for business purposes. But Wallace Eckert discovered that these business machines could be modified for scientific computation. And he persuaded Thomas Watson Sr. at IBM to provide additional equipment. And that became the basis of this Astronomical Computing Bureau, which was the first use of commercial punch card machines in the US for scientific work. Eckert also published the first known book on how to use mechanized computers for scientific applications. And then after the war, he became a key contributor to the creation of IBM's SSEC electromechanical computer, and Los Alamos kind of famously used that machine for early H-bomb calculations. So the two are connected in many different ways. So with that in mind, Dana Mitchell suggested that the lab order a collection of IBM 601 punched card accounting machines. These are sort of the processing units that the lab would need. He believed that these machines could do the work that, well, a calculation that would take a human computer 6 to 8 months to complete. Mitchell thought that these machines could do in approximately 3 to 4 weeks. So it'd be a massive improvement, speed up in time. So the lab's governing board agreed and ordered a collection of 3 of these, along with all the other ancillary equipment you'd need to make them operate. Well, Oppenheimer urged IBM to get the machines out as quickly as possible because they were going to be needed for guiding engineering design. And the machines would be helping to forecast the order of components that would possibly take many months to fabricate. So time was of the essence in getting these machines. but they didn't arrive until the spring of 44, just because of the war and the problem of IBM not being allowed to know where they were going. So that complicated delivery. IBM couldn't even send an installation crew when they finally did send the machines out. They had to, the Army had to use its connections in IBM to find a technician who was already drafted into the Army, and then they kind of requisitioned him to bring him to the Hill to get these machines working. Well, before the equipment could arrive, the lab's main technical goal, the two gun-type weapons, that was starting to change. There was a discovery that the plutonium gun-type weapon may not have been a good idea, and there was some concern over that. And that's one reason why John von Neumann was invited to lab he was an expert in hydrodynamics, mathematician, and asked to help work on some of these problems. Well, he looked at some experiments that Seth Niedermeyer, a physicist, was working with on the idea of implosion. It was floated at Berkeley, so maybe you can use explosives to squish some nuclear material and cause it to go supercritical. Well, he'd been doing experiments, and von Neumann looked at that and realized that implosion might be a really efficient way of using the available nuclear material. Plutonium in particular really interested lab scientists because they would likely have a much larger quantity of that than they would have be able to produce that more quickly through in reactors than the Manhattan Project could produce uranium through separation or enrich uranium through separation techniques. So that's when the lab started to take the idea of implosion a little more seriously by the start of 1944, which was really fortunate because more experimental work in 44 realized that the implosion, or the gun-type plutonium weapon was not going to work. It was just going to fizzle. It would just pre-detonate and you wouldn't get the yield. So that made the lab turn to implosion as the only practical means of using the available plutonium. And that was because the fear was the Manhattan Project was predicted to have enough uranium by mid-45 for only one bomb, but enough plutonium for multiple weapons. So one bomb does not an arsenal make. So the lab had to find a way of making use of the plutonium. Well, the problem with all that was simulating an implosion device required a lot of complex hydrodynamics calculations. How do materials move under extreme temperatures and pressures? Well, the human computers were already overwhelmed with work as it was, but the IBM machines on the way offered a possible solution. So in early 44, before the equipment had even arrived, T Division began to prepare for the implosion problems that the IBM machines would need to run. So a problem would simulate the detonation of a bomb, basically. And running the problem involves cycling a deck of cards through the machines, which would advance the problem one step forward in time with each cycle of machines around, cycle of the cards around the machines in the room. And about a dozen operator steps were necessary with each cycle of these cards. So that was a lot of work. Well, because the machines hadn't arrived yet in early 44, it wasn't possible to test the numerical steps that the T Division had come up with on the machines themselves. So instead, Frankel, Nelson, and Richard Feynman tested the process using human computers. Each computer would have a marchant and would be given a single task to perform. Like the machines would have a single function at a time that they would perform. And as Feynman described the process, one person was the multiplier, the next was the adder, and the next did cubes. And then each computer, after finishing their task, would pass the results on to the next using index cards. But this process ended up being so fast, even with human computers, that they were working at the same speeds that the punch card machines were predicted to operate at. And the only difference was the machines wouldn't tire after working 4 shifts per day, 24 hours per day. Well, after the machines arrived, and after Feynman and Frankel Nelson decided to assemble them themselves, not wait for the IBM technician, Feynman organized a race between the human computers and the machines to check out the machines to make sure they were working properly. And they did a few steps of an implosion simulation. And the two groups actually were very close. They were neck and neck for about 2 days. And the machines only started to pull ahead after the 3rd day, when the hand computing group finally started to fatigue after the really rapid pace. Well, the punch card machines were placed in a new IBM computations group, and Frankel and Nelson became its co-leaders. Well, in March of 44, Hans Bethe reorganized T Division because of the urgency of the implosion problem, and T Division had to tackle that more than anything else. Teller was made the first leader of the implosion group, so they would be in charge of describing mathematically the implosion and for calculating the time of assembly for the high explosives that would compress the nuclear material. But because Teller was still so taken with the idea for the H-bomb, he really didn't do his job in T1. So he was replaced, and he was moved into his own group that was dedicated just to the super, so he could continue working on that. And Stanley Frankel would later be sent to join Teller in his group because Feynman claimed that Frankel had developed the computing disease. He was more interested in doing cool things with the machines than actually working on the assigned task. And that seems to be partially true. It also looks like he had a lot of trouble working with the military personnel who were in charge of operating the machines. So he was kind of promoted out of the way a little bit. But it wasn't in vain. He and Eldred Nelson would collaborate after the war, and they would create the best-selling commercial computer of 1952, and it sold 6 copies. So you can see what computing was like in 1952. And then Frankel had a long career in computing, later went on to design the first portable computer. And it was portable because it was only the size of a desk, and it weighed only about 800 pounds. So that was a major revolution, an 800-pound computer. Well, the IBM equipment was operated mostly by, like I said, members of the military. They were Special Engineering Detachment members, or SEDs. And they were Army recruits who had scientific or technical backgrounds, like electrical engineering. And one of the SEDs in the group was John Kemeny. And people interested in history of computing know him as one of the co-developers of the BASIC programming language. And he also later became the president of Dartmouth. Others, like Harold Ninger, who was an operator, and Francis Noah, who was a key punch operator, they were among the very few civilians who worked on the punch card group. No one who went in to operate these machines had experience with punch card equipment, and they all had to be trained. And at that point, Naomi Livesey was one of the few experts in the world on the use of IBM equipment for scientific applications. And she was the one who trained and led the SEDs and all the others who operated the machines. So she didn't originally come to Los Alamos to work on the IBM equipment, despite her background. But the lab was extremely lucky she showed up right when she did. She was originally from Montana and had a bachelor's in mathematics from Cornell before she went on to get a PhD in mathematics at the University of Wisconsin. And although she was a brilliant mathematician, her mathematics faculty members wouldn't give her the PhD. They insisted she only get a PHM, which is a teaching-oriented degree because they thought that women had no place in mathematics. Well, Joe Hirschfelder was a chemistry professor at the university at the time and saw how terribly Naomi Livesay had been treated. So he helped to find a position for her with the Princeton surveys. They needed a mathematician to work on statistics. And through the surveys, she went to it was Philadelphia to be trained to use IBM punch card machines to work on statistical applications. So she learned to operate and program this IBM equipment over about 6 months. And that meant programming, just to clarify, meant rewiring plug boards, big chunky boards. You had to rewire, and then you could change the boards out to make the machine do something different. Well, the work she was doing for the surveys was very boring, but it won her a very prestigious Rockefeller Foundation Fellowship at the University of Chicago. And after that ended, she became a faculty member at the University of Illinois. And that's the point where she received a letter from Joe Hirschfelder offering her a job on a war project. Where it was, she didn't know, but she accepted. And she left for what she would discover was Los Alamos in February of '44. And that's after clearance arrived. And on her first day at Los Alamos, she discovered she didn't have a job. Joe Hirschfelder's group had been working on the plutonium gun type weapon, and that group had just been eliminated because it no longer had a function. But Joe Hirschfelder and Hans Bethe arranged an interview for Livesay with Frankel Nelson, and that went reasonably well. But she had this problem with this someone she called an odd character who kept coming in and out of the interview and making these ridiculous comments to Stanley Frankel. And she almost didn't take the job because of this guy who introduced himself as Richard Feynman. And only when Feynman appealed to her patriotism and implored her, please take the job, she finally agreed. And she became an assistant scientist before lunch on her first day. Well, the IBM machines arrived about 3 weeks later, and Livesay's job was to program the machines, like I said, by rewiring plug boards, and she trained and supervised the crew of about 24 SEDs and civilians who would operate the machines. And they worked over 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 6 days a week, which was a pretty hectic schedule. So the first implosion simulations that worked on the machines looked at different bomb configurations, different designs, and modeled how an explosive shock wave would travel through the bomb and then it would reflect back from the core. So what would happen? So when the simulated shock wave would reach the interface between 2 materials, so the high explosives and you have the core, what would happen when the shock wave hit the boundary between those 2 materials? Well, the algorithms for that were too complicated for the machines. So that work had to go to the human computers. And a single interface calculation like that would take about 6 or 8 hours for the human computers to do. And that was just one of the points where operators had to intervene with the machines. These were not autonomous machines. They had a lot of hands-on effort to keep them working. So another point where humans had to intervene was with errors. The dust that caused the marchands to stick and have problems, those would also stick to the electrical relays on these machines. And each machine had hundreds of these. And so the T division very smartly designed the calculations to be, as Feynman called them, insensitive to small mistakes. So they could kind of ignore the smaller errors and they would only run the problem again if there were errors in the bigger numbers that they're interested in. But it could still take several times running a problem through the machines to get the answers you needed. So this first implosion work started very slowly on the machines. It took about 3 months to complete the first problem. And machine errors were only part of the problem. Feynman claimed that part of the issue was that the SEDs were being kept in the dark about what exactly they were working on and how important it was to the war effort. So he got permission from Oppenheimer to tell the SEDs, you're working on a bomb that could possibly end the war. And that, he said, really invigorated them. And they began to work faster, and they started to come up with their own designs and methods for speeding up the process. And one idea they came up with was using color-coded cards. So that would, well, before they had these color-coded cards, the regular cards would be run through the machines, sort of one problem at a time. And that would leave a lot of the machines just sitting idle, waiting for the next problem. Well, if you color-coded the cards, you could run multiple parts of a problem, or multiple problems actually, simultaneously. So every machine was constantly being used, and that sped up the time from 3 months for a problem to only about 3 weeks to finish a problem. So massive improvement. As pressure to finish these implosion calculations increased, Naomi Livesay was allowed to hire an assistant. So she selected someone she knew from the University of Illinois, and that was Eleanor Ewing. And Eleanor had a master's in mathematics, and she had a lot of experience in physics, even though her professor made her sit in a separate, isolated row from all the men in her class because, okay. But despite that, she had very good qualifications for the job, but she was off at Pratt & Whitney teaching math, which she found completely boring. But she couldn't leave because it was considered a required job for the war, and she needed permission from the War Manpower Commission to be able to leave. Well, fortunately, she got a letter from Naomi Livesay in 1944 offering her a job, as she said, on an unknown project at an unknown place in New Mexico. And didn't take long for her to leave, and she helped Livesay program the equipment and to keep it operating. And the two shared an office, which they also shared with John von Neumann when he visited the lab. And it was Ewing and Livesay who first introduced and taught von Neumann how to use mechanical computers. And so they taught him how to wire and operate the punch card machines. And he was totally fascinated by them, but he found it really frustrating to set up parallel operations. So he said that soured him on the idea of using parallel computing with electronic computers, and what convinced him to stick with serial computing from that point on. So really interesting, kind of irrational reason for a mathematician to be soured against parallel computing. Well, the lab still needed more and better computing resources, and that spurred John von Neumann to go on a search across the US for new machines. And some of the lab's calculations actually went to Wallace Eckert's lab at Columbia, and IBM expanded his operation just to work on Los Alamos problems. So von Neumann's exposure to mechanized computing at Los Alamos was really what spurred his interest in pursuing mechanized computing for mathematics and scientific problems. And after that point, he became one of the most important evangelists of computing for the rest of his life. He died young in 1957, but he was this instrumental force in helping to encourage the development of electronic computing. But even while von Neumann was searching for new systems, T-Division wasn't just waiting for machines to arrive. Eldred Nelson actually went to talk to the vice president of IBM in New York and persuaded him to build some custom equipment. And one of those custom machines was a punch card machine that could do division natively. The equipment they had didn't do it natively, and it was this Byzantine process of trying to get these machines to do a division. And IBM agreed to build these bespoke machines, and several of them arrived in the end of 44, and they sped up the job very quickly. And these division-capable 601s were totally unique to Los Alamos. I don't think they were used anywhere else. So they helped to speed up computing process, and it was actually the beginning of IBM thinking about modifying and specializing equipment for scientific computation. By the summer of 44, the lab had completely focused on implosion as the only practical means of using the available plutonium. And that was roughly the same time that T Division staff had solved the major problems of calculating neutron diffusion, or they're working on that in 1942, and the problems of critical masses. How do you determine that? And several months before that, Beta and Feynman had actually come up with a formula for efficiency. And that made it possible to help to estimate a device's efficiency when the critical masses were known. These were very important problems that had to be solved to get the accurate computations that were needed. By early 45, the punch card group was focusing exclusively on implosion calculations, and pressure was increasing on getting those done very quickly, because about 300 US soldiers were dying in the war every day. So there was massive pressure to get this work done. Well, that's when Richard Hamming, who's a mathematician, was recruited from the University of Illinois to come and help maintain and keep the machines operating. And he described his job as being a computer janitor, which kind of undersells it. He was more important than that, but he kept the machines running for the physicists, basically. And his wife, Wanda Hamming, actually came to join Los Alamos a little later, and she became a computer for Enrico Fermi and Edward Teller. So Richard Hamming had known nothing about computing machines before he arrived. But when he saw the IBM punch card operation, he said that he realized that science was about to change pretty dramatically. He said that he realized experiments that were impossible in the laboratory were going to be possible with computers. And after that exposure in 46, he took a job at Bell Labs, and his work at Los Alamos inspired him to work on computing while at Bell Labs. And he shared an office with Claude Shannon, who's often called the father of information theory. So an interesting crossover. And Hamming became involved in pretty much all of Bell Labs' most important computing achievements over the next 15 years, and including the error correcting codes that still bear his name today. They're the Hamming codes. But back in 1946, when the Hammings left Los Alamos to drive to Bell Labs, they had bought one of Richard's a colleague's car to make the drive back to New Jersey. And in 1950, the FBI came to interrogate Richard because that colleague was Klaus Fuchs. And Hamming unknowingly had sold the car just weeks before Fuchs had been outed as a spy. That car has a lot of stories behind it in Los Alamos. Well, in early 1945, back to computing, von Neumann had returned to the lab and brought news of this fantastic electronic computer. And it was the ENIAC, and it was the world's first fully electronic general purpose computer. So it meant that it could be reprogrammed to perform almost any task. And that was after a chance encounter with one of its co-developers, Herman Goldstein, on a train platform. He wouldn't have known about it otherwise. It's remarkable. But the ENIAC had the potential to improve computing speeds on the order of several thousand times over conventional methods. And it was thought that the work that a human computer would need about 20 hours to perform, the ENIAC could do in about 30 seconds. So that brought a lot of attention from Los Alamos. The problem was the machine was still being constructed, and it wasn't going to be finished till the end of 45. And that meant it wasn't of much use to the implosion problem. But Edward Teller's group, who was working on the hydrogen bomb, took notice because it was perfect for their problem. And that's why von Neumann arranged for a Los Alamos problem, the very first problem ever run on the ENIAC, to be run in the end of 1945. It was a thermonuclear feasibility study. And Stanley Frankel, who's moved to Teller's group, was one of those who programmed the problem. So that's how he became involved with electronic programming. So the problem filled about 1 million punch cards and traveled to Pennsylvania. And von Neumann actually began immediately working on the design of ENIAC's successor, which would formalize the concept of a stored program computer. So Hermann Goldstein, mentioned involved with ENIAC, he later joined von Neumann at the Princeton Institute for Advanced Study, where von Neumann was on faculty, and he helped to build von Neumann's first computer, the IS machine, which was one of the world's first stored program computers, and it became the basis for the Los Alamos MANIAC computer that Nicholas Metropolis built. And it also became the basis of IBM's first electronic computer, the 701. So the lab connections are kind of ridiculous in a way, but this was a very small community who's interested in these applications. Okay, so how did this elaborate computing effort contribute to the development and success of the Trinity device? Well, after their very slow start in spring of '44, the punch card group, when intervention from the hand computing group on a lot of occasions, had finished about 8 implosion problems by the end of '44 and 17 in 1945. So they really picked up the pace. The exploratory simulations of these different weapons configurations, the designs, revealed that one design in particular, which was called the Mark III device, looked like it was the most practical road to an atomic device of all of those under consideration, at least in the lab's judgment. They use these calculations to inform their judgment on the device. So based on this simulation information, T-Division and the rest of lab's leadership chose to run detailed simulations on the behavior of the Mark III in particular. And the simulation showed that the Fat Man type weapon would produce a very good yield using a sphere of nuclear material. And actually the calculations were just showing up to the point where they're showing, yeah, this looks like it's going to work. And they said, okay, build it. And that's where the Fat Man design came from. Well, this was the design that the lab's leaders ultimately chose to construct. And that's because it was the only design, like I mentioned, that they had detailed data about the extensive data about the behavior of the device already modeled. So the Trinity device was tested in July of '45, and that served as verification for the calculations for the Fat Man design. And these the computing efforts didn't determine the outcome of the lab's wartime program, but the simulation did aid in the design and development choices that the lab's leadership ultimately made, both scientific and engineering. This mechanization of the computing effort with the IBM equipment had greatly accelerated the implosion calculations, and they made it possible to complete these problems in the breakneck pace of the Manhattan Project and complete it as quickly as possible to end the war as quickly as possible. So this is what I've described as the complex and vast collection of technical and human networks that had to come together at Los Alamos to find answers for what was the largest scientific R&D effort in history. People from a lot of backgrounds had to use their skills and their ingenuity to perform these hand calculations and also to adapt very primitive accounting machines to provide the critical answers that the lab needed to help guide the R&D effort that it was charged with completing. And the new networks that they helped to create during the war and the fields of research that they opened up because of these computational abilities they also made Los Alamos a key driver in the rapidly evolving field of scientific computing just after the war and all the way up through today. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Nick. That was very good. It gives us a new and different perspective on how computers came to be and what we now hold in our hand compared to what was in rooms full of equipment in the 40s. So thank you very much. Keith?
Oh, so very happy to.
Nick?
Oh, that was great. That was fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. So
Thank you very much.
Well, appreciate you coming on and doing that for us. Absolutely do.
all right.
Not a problem.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. We appreciate it. And
All
folks,
right, well,
we'll be back.
thank you.
We'll be back in a couple of weeks. Ray, we'll have something new in a couple of weeks. We got a couple of options. We haven't decided which one it is yet. So, but we'll be back in a couple of weeks with another Hidden History Stories from the Secret City. Thanks for watching, folks.